What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today's video is an exciting one because it's one we've been waiting for a very long time. That's because in today's video we're finally going to start putting the GTO's engine back together. So we've got pretty much everything we need to get it going again. Both heads are being built up. You'll have seen that in that video in the top right hand corner. If you haven't watched it, go give it a watch. So both the heads are done. The cams are all nice and clean. So is the timing gears, the cam gear. We've got some brand new piston rings, a piston ring compressor to get them on, a cylinder honing tool to clean the cylinders up just to get rid of the glaze. I finally found another rear main seal because the one I took off over there is cracked. Some brand new main bearings, big end bearings, thrust washers, a new piston, the 2-bolt main. Then we've got the gaskets, head gaskets, cam cover gaskets, and all the little fiddly bits, which is everything we need to start putting this engine back together. And then all the auxiliary stuff like the engine mounts, the alternator, the air conditioning compressor, all the little things, power steering pump, all that. We'll sort that after this video, but we're going to get the main bulk of it built back up today, and we'll get it timed, the new timing belt and the new water pump that I've got for this engine that I bought 2 years ago. So we'll get the block in the middle of the room so we can get you on a stand. We'll get the pistons on the bench so we can start stripping them down and rebuilding them, and we'll get the cylinders honed. So we've moved the block. We'll get the engine hone tool on it just to take the glaze off the cylinders, because we want the new rings to have a nice seat to seat themselves into, and if you go on the glaze it won't really work as it should. So let's get them honed.
So before I begin honing, I'm going to rub a little bit of engine oil in the cylinders, and that is purely just to lubricate the hone as it's going round, because if you were to put the stones in dry, they will go in quite harsh and you can put some very deep grooves into the cylinders, and now you don't want that. So a little bit of engine oil and we should be good to go. So now that the cylinders are lubricated, we can get the honing tool in and we can begin to make a crosshatch. So as you can see now, the cylinder has a nice cross hatch on it, and compared to the one next to it, there's no glaze and there's no shine. So we'll crack on and we'll get the other 6 cylinders done.
So now all the cylinders have been honed. You can see they've all got a nice cross hatch in them. We'll strip the rings off these pistons, put the new ones on, and to do that we'll have to check the ring clearance against the cylinders. So I'll show you exactly how I'm going to do that right now.
So on the trusty whiteboard you can see we have the piston ring tolerances, 1 being the top, 2 being the middle, and oil being the bottom rings. And here's the rings, 1 for the top, 2 for the bottom, and 3 being the oil rings. The first thing we're going to do is remove all the old piston rings and then give the pistons a really good clean to remove any dirt or debris. And if you look closely here, you can see the oil galleries from the inside of the piston that go to the oil ring on the outside. That's why it's corrugated, to help lubricate the piston as it's going up and down in the cylinder. And now I'll do the same on the other 5 pistons. So if you've liked what you've seen so far whilst I'm removing these old piston rings, why don't you jump down below and press that subscribe button and press the like button while you're there, because it's free, it helps the channel, and it doesn't take too long, unlike removing these piston rings. I also have Instagram, so why don't you all give me a follow on that to keep up to date with all the little updates I post on the TT, the GTO, and all future projects that we're going to have on this channel. To measure the piston ring gap, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the ring in the cylinder and then use the crown of the piston to press the ring down to make sure it's straight inside the cylinder. I'll then get my feeler gauges, and on the gap that's created by the ring, I'll get the feeler gauge in, and providing that the width of that gap is within the tolerance limits, the ring is okay to use. If it's not, we'll have to file them down. Luckily enough, every ring I tried on this engine was in tolerance and it was all okay. So now I've got the new piston rings on the pistons, and you can see that all the rings are different. So the second ring is directional, so you have to make sure that that goes in facing the right way. So as you can see now, there's a little indentation on the top of the ring, so when you see that ring, that means that's the top, and that's how it should go onto the piston. And if there's not a dot, usually there's also an etch on the opposite side that says top. So that one is directional. The top ring is actually a universal, it can go in either way, and the oil ring, again, that's the same. So now we can put the pistons in the block, and as you can see on the head of the piston there's an arrow facing forward, which means that points towards where the timing belt is going to go. So the piston has to go in that way. So we'll get the piston ring compression tool on it, tighten it up to get the rings to squash into the piston so we don't have to fight with them when we get them in the cylinder. We'll have the bottom end of the piston hanging out so we can put that into the engine, and then when it seats in just nicely we'll line it up, give it a tap at the back of a hammer, and we'll seat the piston home. And just like that, there's cylinder 1 done. On to the other 5.
So now that all 6 pistons are in and sitting pretty in the block, we'll spin the block upside down, we'll get the new main bearings in, the new big end bearings in the bottom of the rod, and we'll get the brand new crank in. We'll bolt all the rods up, get the crank brace on, and then that is the bottom end of the rotating assembly put back together.
First to put some assembly lube on the main journals, and then I'll put the oil channel side of the main bearings in. After that we'll then stick the thrust washers in, and that sets us up nicely to put the crank in. So it was at this point I realised I probably should have put the crank in first before putting the pistons in, because now I'm going to struggle getting it around the big ends of the rods, but every day's a school day and at least I'll know for next time. Because I'm stubborn, I decided to struggle on anyway, and eventually I got the crank in. But it wasn't in for long, because when I got the crank in I realised I didn't put the bearings on the big ends on the rods, so it had to come back out. But I'm glad I noticed it now and not after I'd torqued everything down, so there's always a silver lining. So now it's round 2 with the crank, and this time it's staying in. So now I'm going to seat the rods against the crank so I can get the big end caps on loosely and torque the big end caps down. Fit the other half of the bearings and the thrust washers to the crank brace, get that on the engine. Torque it down in the sequence on screen now, because that's what Mitsubishi say do. And the crank rotates freely, which is always a good sign. And now it's time to fit the oil pump, the pickup tube and gaskets, and torque that down, and RTV seal the bottom of the block, ready for the oil pan to go on with some fresh new bolts. And that is the oil pan bolted down and the bottom of this engine completely built.
So that is the bottom end rotating assembly put back together. We've got the crank in, the pistons, the rods, the big end bearings, the main bearings, the oil pump, the oil pan, the rear main seal, and now it's time to get the head gaskets, them right there, and everything on that car back on the block. But before I do that, I am going to get cylinder 1 to top dead center, so we know where that piston is in terms of timing it back up, so we don't have any confusion later and bend any of the valves.
So now I've got cylinder 1 to top dead center, and you can see on the crank pulley that it is lined up with the timing marks. So that means we can now get both head gaskets on and get the heads on. So now we'll get the front head on. We'll align the dowel pins on the block to the head to make sure that that's in the right position. Then we'll do the exact same for the rear, and we can move on to the head bolts. When installing the head bolts, I'm going to put some oil on the threads so they don't go in dry, because that's what the manual tells you to do. And then once all the bolts are in and the threads are all oiled, we'll get them torqued up, and you're supposed to do it in 3 stages. You're supposed to tighten it up in a sequence of 3, and then on the last tightening, you torque it down to 125 Newton meters. Then you back the bolts off and you retighten in the same sequence again. And then that is the final torque for the heads.
So that's both heads installed, all the head bolts are back in, torqued up, nice and tight in sequence, and I must admit that was one of the scariest things I've done on this engine so far, because if I've got that wrong and I start it up, we end up with a blown head gasket or coolant gets in the cylinders or what, it could just cause so many issues. So if you did see anything that I did wrong or something I've missed, let me know in the comments down below, because I'd rather know and check before I start it than start it and it go bang. But let's remain positive. So that's both heads on, and now it's time to get the camshafts in. So we've just got to make sure all the little rocker arms are in, and they are actually seated on the lash adjusters and the valves on both sides, but as it stands, the engine actually looks quite good. So I'll get these back on the stand and we'll get the camshafts in.
So the first thing we'll do is we'll put some assembly lube in the cam journals because the engine will have no oil in it, and the last thing you want to do is rotate the cams with no oil because you could damage the journals and the cams, and we'll have to rotate the cam when we come to time the engine up. Now we can fit the exhaust cam, and we need to make sure that the dial pin on the end of the cam where the pulley goes is in the right orientation based on where the manual wants it to be. That's going to be the same for the intake and the opposite bank. If you look on the cam caps, you'll see there's an arrow which points towards the front of the engine, I think, but there's also arrows on the head which tell you that those arrows need to line up and point in the same direction to make sure the caps are on correctly. The caps are also numbered so you can't get them wrong from 1 to 3. So if we do as the manual tells us to, we're all good. Time for more assembly lube, and then we can get the cam caps on and we can get them torqued down and then carry on with the rest of the cams. This bit nearly caught me out because the middle caps are only torqued to 11 Nm and the outer caps are torqued to 20 Nm. But when I first read the manual, I thought that they were all torqued down to 20 Nm, and that to me didn't seem right, so I went over it again and then I realised the centre caps are only 11. So I'm glad I double checked, because the last thing I'd want to do is drill out the bolts on this head and get metal filings in the heads and then have to clean them again.
So now both camshafts are in on both banks. They're both torqued down on the middle caps, the end caps. We just need to now install the camshaft bearings in the sides, the blanking plates on the opposite side, and the engine is getting that little bit closer to actually starting up for the first time in 2 years. I must admit, building an engine is very nerve-wracking because, again, like I said previously, anything little that you can miss can cause a massive problem further down the line, to the point of where you might even need a new engine. But both camshafts are in on both sides and the engine is just looking that little bit more complete. So what we'll do next is we'll get the seals in the front, there and there. We'll get the seals in the backs, they're more just like blanking plates. And then we'll get the timing pulleys on the front, and then we can get all the timing gear on the front of the engine, including the timing belt, get it timed up. We'll see if it spins freely. I really hope it spins freely. So I've now got both camshafts in, and I only realised after the fact that my camera had stopped recording, so unfortunately I didn't catch it, but all I did was slightly lubricate the seals, give them a bit of a tap, and get a 30mm socket on the end just to seat them all the way on the backs. I then did the same on the front, the only difference being with the snouts on these crank being so long, I put the old seals there, both of them, so I could hit it with the socket to seat that properly, and then the old seals just slid straight out. Same on that one. And I've got the timing belt guide covers in there, and the heat shield in the middle. So that is all on now. So now we can get this water pump on, which I bought for this engine 2 years ago with the new timing belt and idlers, because me thinking I just needed to do the timing belt and the water pump and the engine would be okay. Clearly not, but I can finally fit it now. So in this box we have a brand new timing belt, a brand new water pump, the 2 idler pulleys for the timing belt, and then fresh gaskets and a fresh seal for the pipe that goes in there. But that gasket kit I bought also has those seals and gaskets. So I'm going to use the gaskets off that one because I feel like I trust that one more than these, to be quite honest. So let's fit this new water pump. Just like that.
So for this next thing, I've done this really detailed drawing, and it looks like it came from the manual itself. But the reason for the drawing is we're now going to fit all the ancillaries for the timing belt, including the pulleys and the brackets, and they all have specific torque specs that they need to be torqued down to. So the reason for the drawing is it just makes it easier than going on my phone all the time. I can just refer to the trusty whiteboard.
So we've got to fit and torque the timing gears, but to do this is a little different than everything else because you've got to hold them in place using the cams. And to do that, on the cam, there's little hexagonal moulds in the casting. So you get a spanner on this side, and as you're torquing that side, you hold it there so the cam doesn't rotate whilst you're trying to torque the pulley. So hopefully I've got a spanner big enough to get on there. If not, I have got adjustables I can use, so we'll get that on and we'll try and get these cam gears torqued.
So when I removed these pulleys from the cams, I marked the pulleys with an E for the exhaust exhaust and an eye for the intake, so I knew what cam they came off, so when I put them back on I know exactly where they go. So it turns out a 24mm spanner fits nice and snug on a hexagonal cast. But the weird thing is, it's different on the opposite side, didn't go over, so I needed to use an adjustable for that side. But I'm just glad they had something big enough to hold them. And that is all 4 cam gears torqued to spec. So in order to time up the GTO's engine, we need to see the visual arrows for the timing marks, but I've only just realised the timing marks for this engine are on the cam covers. So we need to put the cam covers on, but I'm not going to bolt them down because they need to come off to be painted and resealed anyway. But we'll put them on now so we can see where the timing marks line up so we can get this engine timed.
So now that all the ancillaries for the timing belt are on the engine and they're torqued up, we now need to align these timing marks there, there, there and there with the marks on the engine, on the case, sorry. So that needs to come this way, this needs to go that way, and the rears are actually pretty close to in time as they are. So now we'll get the timing belt on, we'll route it round the way it should, based on 1, the manual, and 2, my crude drawing on the trusty whiteboard. I've also just fitted the tensioner idler, but it's not tight. The reason it's not tight is that it needs to sway. So when you tighten the timing belt down with this, you also need to preload it by moving this in, which then adds more tension to the belt. So once the belt's on, we'll pre-tension it, then we'll pull that pin out, which lets the cylinder fire forward to swing this arm up and add tension to the timing belt. So I've just had a reread through the workshop manual and I noticed it says on the auto tensioner up here, you need to apply thread sealant to the bolts. I don't know why. They must go through an oil gallery for the turbochargers or something like that, or the oil cooler, the way it interferes. But on the NA engines, it doesn't seem necessary, but on the turbo engines, that's a must. And we don't want any oil leaks. So I've gone back, I've done that, and I've retorqued those bolts. So as you can see on the crankshaft side of things, there's that pin. And then that pin lines up with the tooth, which lines up with the timing mark that tells you cylinder 1 is at top dead center. But what we've got to do, it seems very counterintuitive, is you've got to rotate this anti-clockwise by 1 tooth, and that's because as the belt comes up here, you're going to have slack within these pulleys. And what you need to do is when you rotate that anti-clockwise 1 tooth, as it rotates clockwise, it'll pick up the slack and it'll allow that tooth to line up. So when you tighten it all up, time everything up at the top as well as the bottom, give it a full rotation, that tooth will then line up with that mark, and all the markings up here should also line up with the markings on the heads there and there. So again, it seems very counterintuitive and it is quite a scary thing to do, but it does work because I've done this last time on my NA GTO and hope it doesn't go wrong, because if it does, it makes me look stupid and I'm going to have to do it all again. So as you can see here now, I've rotated this anti-clockwise the tooth. There's the notch at the top, there's the tooth next to it. So now we should be ready to fit the timing belt. So just like in the video where I took the engine apart, I'm going to use the 2 spanners and cable tie trick to get these 2 gears in time. Get the belt round this, over them, round the back, down, and then we'll rotate this. Again, using another hack because Mitsubishi have a special tool for that I don't have. And we'll tighten it all up, give it a full rotation, and hopefully it's all in time.
All I'm doing here is I'm manually rotating the cams with the spanners to get the timing marks to line up with the arrows on the head. I'll then cable tie the spanners together to keep them in position in time. Just be careful if you do it this way in case they slip, in case the cable ties come loose for whatever reason. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to also apply a bit of pressure with my hands whilst I'm routing the belt around and over the top of the cam pulleys. When fitting the timing belt, have it going over the far left pulley first and then work your way towards the right when you're facing the engine. And as you're doing this, you need to make sure that you keep tension on the belt, especially while it goes around the water pump. Otherwise you'll probably end up being a tooth off by the time it does a rotation and everything is under tension.
So as you can now see, that yellow mark there lines up with that arrow. Under there you can see the yellow mark, that lines up with that arrow. That yellow timing mark is just off, but the tension should pick that up to line up with that arrow. Same with that, to line up with that arrow. And that's why we rotated that 1 tooth anti-clockwise, to pick that tension up and everything in between. So now we'll have to rotate this clockwise to add more tension to the belt. And to do that, I'll show you exactly what I want to do. So to add tension to this belt, without having a special tool for this, what I have got is a pair of C-clip pliers. Ideally, it's better if you've got the right angled one so you can add leverage that way. But we'll get these in here, nice fit, and we'll rotate them to add tension to the belt. There, the spanners have jumped off. And then once we've got a bit of tension on that belt, then get a 14mm underneath. Tighten that up. Now that belt is under tension, as is the rest. So when we rotate this, that one tooth off there should pick up the slack and we'll have it all in time. So what we'll do now in order to get this to spin properly is we'll get the harmonic bouncer back on. See a little pin there that lines up with the pin in there. The hole. Just nip that up to the point where you can feel it move. And now it's time to rotate it to make sure the timing belt and all the gears stay in time. And because we're rotating it by hand, we've left the spark plugs out because you don't want any compression, just to make it that bit easier to spin it round. So if all of that is timed up as it should be, we'll do a full rotation on the engine to make sure the cams have gone a full rotation round. And then when we get them back in time, that lower tooth, the notch in the crankshaft pulley, should be back to where it was just then. And that means the engine is fully timed and it's timed correctly. Then we can tighten up the tensioner pulley and pull the pin on the hydraulic tensioner to get that to apply tension to the belt. The engine has got assembly lube in it, so in terms of rotating it with no oil, it is okay, because I have lubricated everything as I put it back together. So now let's give it a spin. So now I'm going to use the clutch basket removal tool for the motorbike, because I don't have the right tool for that, which I did use to take this off when I started disassembling the engine in that video. So if you haven't saw that, click that one. And the reason being is there's two pins on the back, so I'll get the pins in here. And now we're going to go anti-clockwise enough to take the timer marks off time, technically. And that is to put tension on the belt one way, and then we'll come back clockwise to get the two on the top in time, them two in time. And then when we look down through there, we should see that notch be either bang on the arrow, hopefully, or sometimes with these it's just off, but that's as close as you're going to get it. So we'll go anti-clockwise just to take them off time. So as you can see, they're just off time by a tooth, and they're off time by a tooth. And then we'll go clockwise again to get them in time. So they're now in time, and they're in time. And just down here, that notch is as close to in time as it's going to be. It's less than, what, a third of a tooth, which isn't that bad.
So now the moment of truth, the terrifying part, because if I've got this wrong, I could cause a bit more damage than I'd like to. But if I get it right, then fantastic. Don't have to do it again, but if I've got it wrong, I'll have to take the belt off again and do that whole process one more time. So let's hope it works.
Oh, I'm nervous. So everything seems free so far. So they're back in time, which is good. These top two are back in time, which is even better. And just in there is exactly where it was before. So that's good news. That means the engine is correctly timed, which means we can also now tighten up the tensioner pulley again, pull the pin out on the hydraulic tensioner, and that timing belt is on. That's such an unnecessarily scary process. The same again, I haven't got the tool, but I'll use these. Get this in, loosen it off slightly, keep applying the rotational pressure, tighten it back up, Now we can pull that pin out, which allows that pin there to press against that arm to swing this whole tensioner forward and add more tension to this belt. And there it is. Now that the auto tensioner hydraulic pin's being pulled, you can see it lines up so much better. So as the hydraulic fluid forces that pin out against that lever, that will now automatically apply tension to the belt. So like I said before, over time when the belt starts to stretch as it goes through heat cycles and just general wear and tear, that will keep everything tight, everything taut up and in time. Because if it doesn't, the engine goes boom. So I've took the rocker covers back off. They're on the bench over there because they need to be painted. But now that everything's in time, one thing we do need to install is the crank angle sensor that goes on the back of the rear bank intake cam. So we'll go over to that now. We'll fit that properly, bolt that up, and that is going to be everything for this video in terms of getting the engine in time. And it's exciting to see it going back together. And it's not going to be long until we can get the engine back in the GTO and hopefully doesn't go boom on the first start. So this is a crank angle sensor, and what that does is this, as you can see here, has two arms either side. This goes into the cam on the rear intake cam, and as this rotates like so, it tells the engine what position and what angle the crank is in. The reason it does that is because it helps the engine decide how much fueling to put in, helps the engine decide timing, and that is all relative based on the engine's RPM. It doesn't just know, it needs this, and it needs to know where it is on this to be able to fuel the engine properly, set the right timing for the spark, and make sure your engine runs at a higher RPM. And that's why when fitting a crank angle sensor, you need to make sure you fit it correctly, otherwise the engine will get incorrect data, meaning it won't be able to set the timing right for the spark. It won't be able to set what fuel and mixture it needs based on the engine's RPM. And to do that, Mitsubishi have said that on this sensor here, don't know if you can see it, there's a notch, and on the arms there, on that arm there, again, there's another notch. So you need to line that up to make sure it's straight. Then when you put it into the cam, in this case, when you put it into the cam here, in those slotted grooves, you need to make sure that the markings line up with each other so it goes in the right orientation. So when it does start rotating, the engine knows exactly where it is, what fueling to set, and what time to set. And I really hope I haven't got that wrong. So now we'll get the sensor in, we'll make sure those fingers line up with the grooves in there, and based on where it bolts down, it can only go in one way, so I can't put it in upside down, which is good. But the first thing I need to do is, because oil comes out of here, because it is the camshaft, I'm missing an O-ring off this because I am replacing it, so we need to get the O-ring on this and we can get it in. So now we've got a fresh O-ring on. I've put a little bit of oil around the edges just so it doesn't go in dry. The marks on that are now lined up with the notch on the side of the case, so we can get this lined up, get this nut off first, otherwise we're not going to get it in. Get this lined up, get it in the cam, and make sure it seats as it should. And there she is, sat home. And the good thing is, if you saw the teardown video when I took that cam angle sensor off, you'll know that I punch marked the cam angle sensor. If you haven't saw the video, it's up there, go give it a watch, then come back to this one. But I line the marks up with a center punch, so I punch the edges of the aluminium just to make sure when I put it back on, it lines up as it should. And lo and behold, if the camera will make it out, that mark there and that mark there line up perfectly. So we know we've done something right. So now we'll get the washer and the nut back on, get it down nice and tight, and that is the cam angle sensor fitted. Now the manual says that this needs to be tightened down to 12 newton meters. So we'll set the torque wrench up, we'll get it on like so, and we'll push till it clicks. And that's that. That doesn't feel that tight, but if the manual says it, it must be right. So guys, that's going to be everything for today's video. We've done a lot, and it's looking a lot more like an engine. But if you've enjoyed the content today, make sure you click the subscribe button down below and check out that playlist of the engine rebuild, up to date. And you can kind of see what we've had to go through to get to this point. And if you stay tuned by clicking the subscribe again, you'll be able to see the first start. You'll see me put the engine in the car, and you'll also see me do the gearbox, because there's a common problem on that, which I'll touch on in that video, that needs to be fixed before it goes back in the GTO. Otherwise, you're taking it back out to fix it next time. So Might as well do it while we're here. But we've got a lot done on the GTO's engine. It's all fully tanned and it looks a lot more like an engine. It's nice and clean, everything's all shiny. Well, not everything, but most of it's all shiny and new. The cam angle sensor's back on and it gets me that little bit more excited to get it back in the car. But thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit that notifications bell so you get an update every time I post a video, and I'll see you in the next one.
Afraid to turn out the lights.